The automatic doors to the emergency department burst open with a violence that immediately set Sarah's nerves on edge. But this time, it wasn't medical personnel who entered. Instead, three men in dark clothing stormed through the entrance, their faces concealed by black ski masks, their movements aggressive and purposeful. The lead figure raised his weapon, a semi-automatic pistol that gleamed under the fluorescent lights with a malevolent shine that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the harsh hospital lighting. The gun looked military-grade, the kind of weapon that belonged on a battlefield, not in a place dedicated to healing. "Nobody move!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls and mixing with the sudden silence that fell over the emergency department like a suffocating blanket. "This is a robbery! Everyone on the ground now!" The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above the emergency department as Sarah Chen adjusted her stethoscope for the third time that evening. At 26, she had been working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital for 2 years, and the weight of responsibility never felt lighter. The antiseptic smell clung to her navy blue scrubs, a constant reminder of the world she inhabited. A world where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah didn't tremble under pressure. She never had. Even as a child growing up in San Francisco's Chinatown, when her mother worked double shifts at the textile factory and her father drove taxis 16 hours a day, Sarah had been the calm one. When her younger brother Kevin broke his arm falling from their fire escape, 8-year-old Sarah had wrapped it in kitchen towels and walked him 6 blocks to the emergency room, never once crying, never once panicking. The nurses there had been amazed by her composure, her instinctive understanding of what needed to be done. "That little girl has the heart of a healer," one of them had told her parents that night. 26 years old now, Dr. Patricia Huang still worked at St. Mary's, and she often reminded Sarah of that first meeting. "You were born for this," she would say during particularly difficult shifts. Tonight felt no different as Sarah checked the trauma bay one final time, ensuring every instrument was exactly where it needed to be. The monitors beeped steadily in the background, creating a symphony she had long since memorized. Each beep represented life, hope, the delicate balance between recovery and crisis that defined her chosen profession. Her colleagues often remarked how she moved through chaos with the precision of a surgeon and the calm of a meditation instructor. While other nurses grew frazzled during multi-trauma incidents, Sarah seemed to slow down, her movements becoming more deliberate, her voice softer, but somehow more commanding. She had a gift for making panicked patients feel safe, for helping families understand complex medical situations, for being exactly where she needed to be when crisis struck. "Chen, we've got incoming!" called Dr. Marcus Rodriguez from across the department, his voice cutting through the typical evening bustle. "ETA 4 minutes. Elderly male, possible cardiac event. Paramedics report he's conscious but in distress." Sarah nodded, her mind already shifting into crisis mode. 4 minutes. Enough time to prep the cardiac monitoring equipment, not enough time to overthink the 100 variables that could complicate an elderly patient's treatment. She gathered the crash cart, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she checked the defibrillator, ensured the medications were properly stocked, and positioned herself near the ambulance bay doors. The November rain hammered against the windows with increasing intensity, each drop catching the emergency room's harsh lighting like tiny diamonds against the black night. Weather like this always meant more accidents, more emergencies, more families whose worlds would change forever before sunrise. Sarah had learned to read the patterns. Storm nights brought broken bones from slip and fall accidents, cardiac episodes triggered by the stress of power outages, domestic disturbances that escalated when people felt trapped indoors. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see the ambulance's red and blue lights approaching, their reflection dancing across the wet pavement like some kind of emergency aurora. The vehicle's sirens grew louder, then cut off abruptly as it pulled into the bay. Sarah took a deep breath, centering herself for whatever was about to come through those doors. But as the ambulance doors swung open, Sarah realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary night. The paramedics wheeled in an elderly man, his weathered face pale against the white sheets, but his eyes alert and determined. Sarah's trained eye immediately assessed the situation. Conscious but struggling, labored breathing consistent with cardiac distress, possible myocardial infarction, but stable enough to be talking. His gray hair was neatly combed despite the circumstances, and he wore a faded red flannel shirt that had seen better decades. But it was the tattoo on his forearm that made her pause. A faded eagle, globe, and anchor. Marine Corps. The ink had blurred with age, but the symbol was unmistakable to anyone who knew military insignia. Sarah's own grandfather had served in the Pacific during World War II, and she recognized the look in this man's eyes. The particular combination of toughness and dignity that came from serving your country. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" Sarah asked, taking his wrist to check his pulse as they transferred him to the gurney. His skin was papery but warm, his pulse irregular, but not critically so. "Frank! Frank Morrison," he wheezed, his voice carrying the distinctive rasp of a man who had smoked for decades before quitting, probably on doctor's orders. "Served 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in infantry, 1 in logistics." Even in distress, he felt compelled to share his service record, as if his military experience somehow qualified him to handle this medical emergency better than most. "Well, Frank Morrison, you're in excellent hands now," Sarah said, her voice steady and reassuring as she attached the cardiac monitoring leads to his chest. "We're going to take excellent care of you. Can you tell me what you were doing when the chest pain started?" "Watching the news," Frank managed between labored breaths. "Story about some politician. Got my blood pressure up, I guess. Pain started right here." He gestured to his chest, then spread down my left arm. Felt like someone was standing on my chest. Classic presentation, Sarah thought, already calculating medication dosages and treatment protocols. "On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the pain right now?" "About a 7, Frank replied, then added with a weak smile, "But I've had worse." Of course he had. In Sarah's experience, veterans rarely complained about pain, having learned to endure discomfort that would incapacitate most civilians. It was both admirable and problematic. They often minimized symptoms that required immediate attention. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to know that rating your pain accurately helps us treat you better," Sarah explained as she prepared to insert an IV line. "There's no shame in admitting when something hurts. We need the real numbers." Frank's expression softened slightly. "Maybe an 8 then. Feels like my chest is in a vice." "Thank you for being honest," Sarah said, successfully placing the IV on her first attempt, despite the dim lighting and Frank's slightly dehydrated condition. "We're going to give you something for the pain and run some tests to see exactly what's happening with your heart." As they wheeled Frank toward the trauma bay, Sarah noticed how he kept glancing around the emergency department, his eyes taking in exit routes, potential threats, the positions of staff members. Old habits from military training, probably. Many veterans never fully shed their tactical awareness, their need to assess and analyze their environment, even in civilian setting. "Busy night?" Frank asked, his breathing slightly improved now that he was lying flat and receiving supplemental oxygen. "Not too bad," Sarah replied, though she could see at least a dozen other patients in various stages of treatment throughout the department. A teenager with what looked like a broken wrist, an elderly woman receiving IV fluids, a middle-aged man getting stitches in his forehead. Typical Friday night emergencies. Nothing we can't handle. Dr. Rodriguez appeared at Frank's bedside, his expression professional but kind. Marcus had been Sarah's mentor since her first day at St. Mary's, and she had learned to read his subtle cues during patient interactions. Right now he looked concerned but not panicked, a good sign for Frank's prognosis. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Dr. Rodriguez," he said, pulling up Frank's preliminary test results on the bedside monitor. "Your EKG shows some irregularities that we want to investigate further. We're going to run a few more tests, get you some medication for the pain, and monitor your heart rhythm for the next few hours." "Doc, I've got to ask," Frank said, his military directness cutting through medical pleasantries. "Am I having a heart attack?" Dr. Rodriguez paused, considering his words carefully. "We can't rule it out yet, but your symptoms and initial tests suggest it might be what we call unstable angina. Serious, but not necessarily a full heart attack. The next few hours will tell us more." Frank nodded, processing this information with the same calm acceptance he had probably applied to dangerous situations throughout his military career. "What do you need me to do?" "Rest, let us monitor you, and try not to worry," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "Nurse Chen here is one of our best. You're in excellent hands." Sarah felt a familiar surge of pride at the compliment, but also the weight of responsibility that came with Dr. Rodriguez's confidence in her abilities. She had earned that trust through 2 years of consistent performance, countless late nights, and an innate understanding of when to follow protocol and when to trust her instincts. What happened next would test both her instincts and her courage in ways she never could have imagined. As they settled Frank into the cardiac monitoring bay, the automatic doors to the emergency department burst open with a violence that immediately set Sarah's nerves on edge. But this time, it wasn't Mamwabwa's medical personnel who entered. Instead, 3 men in dark clothing stormed through the entrance, their faces concealed by black ski masks, their movements aggressive and purposeful. The lead figure raised his weapon, a semi-automatic pistol that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, with a malevolent shine that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the harsh hospital lighting. The gun looked military-grade, the kind of weapon that belonged on a battlefield, not in a place dedicated to healing. "Nobody move!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls and mixing with the sudden silence that fell over the emergency department like a suffocating blanket. "This is a robbery. Everyone on the ground now." The emergency department, which moments before had been filled with the controlled chaos of medical care, froze as if someone had pressed a pause button on life itself. Nurses stopped mid-stride, their hands still holding syringes or medical charts. Doctors looked up from their computers, their expressions shifting from medical concentration to shocked disbelief. Patients in the waiting area ducked behind chairs, some crying softly, others too stunned to make any sound at all. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it, but her nursing training kicked in immediately. Her mind began automatically assessing the situation. 3 armed individuals, approximately 15 staff members in the immediate area, at least 20 patients in various stages of treatment. Several patients were connected to life support equipment that couldn't be moved. Others were in critical condition and couldn't afford to have their treatment interrupted. She positioned herself between the gunman and Frank's monitoring bay, her body creating a barrier between the weapons and her patient. Behind her, she could hear Frank's heart monitor continuing its steady beeping, a strange counterpoint to the terrifying silence that had fallen over the rest of the department. "Please," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension, with a steadiness that surprised even her. "We have patients here who need immediate medical attention. Some of them are in critical condition. Take whatever you want from the pharmacy, the safe, our personal belongings, anything you need, but please let us continue treating." "Shut up!" the lead gunman snarled, swinging his weapon toward her with a speed that made several people gasp. "I said nobody moves, and that includes you, nurse. Get on the ground with everyone else." Sarah could see his finger on the trigger, could see the slight tremor in his hands that suggested drugs or extreme nervousness, both dangerous in someone holding a loaded weapon. Her medical training helped her recognize the signs. Dilated pupils visible through the eye holes of his mask, rapid breathing, the kind of jittery energy that came from stimulants. "I understand you're in charge here," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm and non-threatening, while subtly shifting to better shield Frank from potential gunfire. "But some of these patients will die if we stop their treatment. That's not something you want on your conscience." The second gunman, smaller than the first but somehow more menacing in his stillness, moved toward the pharmacy area where the controlled substances were kept. The third headed for the nurse's station, probably looking for cash or anything valuable that could be quickly converted to money. But Frank Morrison, despite his cardiac distress, despite being 73 years old, despite every logical reason to stay quiet and hope the situation resolved itself without violence, began to sit up on his monitoring gurney. His weathered hands gripped the bed rails as he pulled himself upright, the motion causing his heart monitor to spike with the increased activity. His eyes, clouded with pain, but sharp with the kind of determination that comes from decades of military service, fixed on the lead gunman with an intensity that seemed to fill the room. When Frank Morrison looked at those ski-masked figures, he didn't see criminals to be feared. He saw enemies to be confronted. "Son," Frank said, his voice stronger than it had been since arriving at the hospital, carrying the authority of someone who had faced down enemies in actual combat. "You need to put that weapon down and walk away right now. These people are trying to save lives and you're interfering with their mission." The gunman spun toward Frank, his finger tightening on the trigger with a motion that Sarah recognized from 100 movies but had never hoped to see in real life. In that split second, time seemed to slow down to an agonizing crawl. She could see everything with crystalline clarity. The muzzle of the gun swinging toward Frank's chest, the old Marine's defiant expression showing no fear despite facing down an armed criminal, the gunman's finger beginning to apply pressure to the trigger. She saw Frank's military tattoo, faded but proud, on his forearm. She saw the wedding ring on his finger that suggested someone at home was waiting for him to return safely. She saw the small American flag pin on his flannel shirt, the kind that veterans wear not for show, but as a quiet statement of service and sacrifice. She didn't think. She acted. In the space between heartbeats, Sarah threw herself in front of Frank just as the first shot rang out with a deafening crack that seemed to shatter the air itself. The bullet tore through her left shoulder, spinning her partially around and sending fire racing down her arm. The impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer, but somehow the pain seemed distant, as if it were happening to someone else. The second shot came almost immediately, catching her in the side just below her ribs as she completed her turn, the force of it driving the breath from her lungs and dropping her to her knees. But she had protected Frank's chest. The third bullet, meant for the old Marine's heart, buried itself in her right thigh as she fell, the impact sending shockwaves of agony up her leg and into her spine. The pain was extraordinary, unlike anything she had ever experienced. It felt like fire and ice colliding inside her body, like electricity and razor blades dancing through her nervous system. But even as she collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor, even as her vision blurred and her ears rang from the gunshots, Sarah heard Frank's voice behind her crying out in a tone she had heard in war movies but never in real life. "Corpsman! Corpsman!" The old Marine's battle cry echoing through the trauma bay, calling for the medics who had saved so many lives in Vietnam decades ago. The emergency department erupted into chaos. Security guards burst through the doors, their radios crackling with urgent communications. The gunmen fled toward the exits, leaving behind the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with antiseptic, the sound of alarms, and the sight of a young nurse bleeding on the floor, because she had chosen to protect a patient rather than herself. Sarah lay there, her cheek pressed against the cool floor, watching her own blood pool beneath her in a spreading crimson stain that seemed surreal, like special effects from a movie. She could hear Frank shouting for help, could hear Dr. Rodriguez barking orders, could hear the controlled panic of medical professionals dealing with one of their own being critically injured. But through the pain and the shock and the growing weakness, one thought remained crystal clear in Sarah's mind. Frank Morrison was alive. The bullets meant for him had found her instead, and he was alive. The next few hours passed in a haze of emergency surgery, morphine-induced dreams, and worried faces hovering over her hospital bed like concerned angels. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally aware of conversations happening around her, but unable to focus enough to understand the words. She remembered glimpses of the operating room's bright lights, the reassuring beeping of monitors, the gentle pressure of hands checking her pulse and adjusting her IV lines. When she finally surfaced from the anesthesia with anything approaching clarity, dawn light was filtering through the windows of her private room, painting everything in soft shades of gold and pink. Her body felt like it had been taken apart and reassembled by someone who wasn't quite sure how all the pieces fit together. 3 bullets removed, the surgeon had told her during one of her more lucid moments. 47 stitches holding her back together. No permanent damage to vital organs, though they said it was nothing short of miraculous. The bullet that had entered her shoulder had missed her subclavian artery by less than an inch. The one in her side had somehow avoided her liver, spleen, and major blood vessels. The thigh wound, while painful, had struck only muscle tissue. Dr. Rodriguez sat beside her bed, his usually composed expression replaced by something Sarah had never seen before. A mixture of admiration, concern, and what looked almost like awe. His normally perfect hair was disheveled, and his scrubs showed the telltale stains of a long night in surgery. "Frank's stable," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Full recovery expected. The cardiac episode was brought on by stress, not an actual heart attack. You saved his life, Sarah. There's absolutely no question about that." Sarah nodded weakly, the painkillers making everything feel distant and dreamlike. Even her own voice sounded strange to her ears, thick and slow. How is he handling everything? Asking about you every 5 minutes, Dr. Rodriguez replied with a tired smile. Says he owes you a debt he can never repay. He's been in the waiting room since they brought you out of surgery, refusing to go home until he knows you're okay. The image of Frank Morrison sitting in an uncomfortable hospital chair, probably still wearing that faded flannel shirt, waiting for news about her condition, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She had done her job. She had protected a patient who couldn't protect himself. That knowledge felt better than any painkiller the doctors could give her. But Dr. Rodriguez's expression was growing serious, and Sarah could sense that there was something else he needed to discuss. Sarah, there's something else we need to talk about. Something important. The tone in his voice made Sarah's stomach clench despite the medications coursing through her system. What is it, Marcus? Dr. Rodriguez couldn't meet her eyes, a tell that Sarah had learned to recognize during their 2 years of working together. When Marcus avoided eye contact, bad news was coming. Hospital administration wants to see you as soon as you're able to walk. There are concerns about protocol violations. Protocol violations. The words hit Sarah harder than the bullets had, sending a chill through her body that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. What kind of concerns? You left your designated position during an active threat situation, Dr. Rodriguez said, his voice careful and clinical, as if he were reading from a prepared statement. You engaged with armed individuals instead of following established lockdown procedures. According to the administration, you put yourself and potentially other patients at risk by not following the hospital's emergency protocols. Sarah stared at him, her pain-fogged mind struggling to process what she was hearing. I saved Frank Morrison's life. I know that, Dr. Rodriguez said softly, finally meeting her eyes. Everyone who is there knows that, but that's not how administration sees it. How do they see it? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. Dr. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. They see a liability issue. They see someone who violated established safety protocols and created additional risk exposure for the hospital. They see someone who acted outside the scope of established procedures. Sarah felt something cold and heavy settling in her chest, a weight that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. They're going to discipline me for saving a patient's life? Sarah, I tried to explain the situation to them. I told them that your actions were heroic, that you saved Frank's life, that any reasonable person would have done the same thing. Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression intense. But they're not seeing it that way. They're focused on policy violations and liability concerns. What does that mean exactly? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand that her world was about to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. It means you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this situation might not end the way you expect it to, Dr. Rodriguez said carefully. The hospital is treating this as a serious policy violation, not a heroic act. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to reconcile the disconnect between what felt right and what the hospital administration apparently considered proper procedure. She had acted on instinct, driven by her fundamental belief that nurses were supposed to protect patients, even at personal cost. The idea that this could somehow be considered wrong felt like discovering that up was down and black was white. Marcus, if you were in my position, if you saw a gunman about to shoot an elderly patient in your care, what would you have done? Dr. Rodriguez was quiet for so long that Sarah opened her eyes to look at him. His expression was troubled, conflicted. Honestly, I hope I would have been brave enough to do exactly what you did. But the hospital has policies for reasons, Sarah. They're designed to protect everyone, staff and patients. But they didn't protect Frank, Sarah pointed out. I protected Frank. I know, Dr. Rodriguez said simply. And that's what makes this whole situation so difficult. 3 days later, Sarah found herself sitting across from a panel of hospital administrators in a sterile conference room that smelled of stale coffee and disappointment. Her left arm was in a sling, and every movement sent dull aches through her healing wounds. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the cold, clinical atmosphere of the room. The conference table was polished mahogany, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most nurses made in a month. The walls were lined with certificates and awards celebrating the hospital's commitment to patient care and safety, ironic decorations given the nature of the meeting. Margaret Whitfield, the chief administrator, sat at the head of the table wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked like it had been tailored specifically for delivering bad news. Her silver hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her features, and her pale blue eyes held all the warmth of a January morning. Beside her sat Dr. James Kellerman, the medical director, whose expression suggested he would rather be anywhere else in the world. To their left was Patricia Wells, the hospital's legal counsel, a woman whose entire demeanor screamed lawsuit prevention. The final member of the panel was Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, the director of risk management, whose job it was to identify and minimize anything that might cost the hospital money. "Miss Chen," Margaret began, her voice as sharp as her suit was pressed, "while we acknowledge your heroic intentions during the incident on November 15th, the fact remains that you violated multiple hospital safety protocols in a situation that could have resulted in significantly worse outcomes." Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, still struggling to believe that she was being called to account for saving a man's life. She had expected recognition, maybe even commendation. Instead, she was facing what looked increasingly like a disciplinary hearing. "Hospital policy clearly states," continued Dr. Kellerman, reading from a thick manual that Sarah had never seen before, "that during active threat situations, all personnel are to immediately implement lockdown procedures. This includes securing patients in place, taking cover, and waiting for security forces to neutralize the threat. Under no circumstances are medical personnel to engage with armed individuals." Sarah listened to the words, trying to imagine how following those procedures would have saved Frank Morrison's life. "So if I had followed policy, Mr. Morrison would be dead right now." "That's not the point," Margaret snapped, her professional composure slipping slightly. "The point is that your actions, while well-intentioned, violated established protocol and could have resulted in additional casualties. What if your decision to engage had escalated the situation? What if the gunman had opened fire on the entire emergency department? What if other patients had been harmed as a result of your intervention?" Sarah felt something cold and hard settling in her chest. "But they weren't harmed. Frank Morrison is alive because I acted." "Because you got lucky," Dr. Kellerman interrupted, his tone suggesting that luck was somehow morally objectionable. "But luck isn't policy, Ms. Chen. Policy exists to protect everyone, staff, patients, visitors, and the hospital itself. Policy is based on careful analysis of risk factors and optimal outcomes for the greatest number of people." "What about optimal outcomes for the individual patient?" Sarah asked. "What about Frank Morrison specifically?" Patricia Wells, the legal counsel, spoke for the first time. "Ms. Chen, while we understand your concern for individual patients, the hospital must consider its broader obligations. We have a duty to provide a safe environment for everyone who enters our facilities. That sometimes means making difficult decisions about resource allocation and risk management." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system and the distant sounds of hospital life continuing beyond the conference room walls. Sarah stared at the mahogany table, at the neat stacks of papers that apparently detailed her transgressions, at the untouched water glasses that seemed to mock the seriousness of the proceedings. "What are you saying exactly?" Sarah asked finally, her voice steady despite the growing certainty that her world was about to collapse around her. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she was delivering a verdict she had already decided before the meeting began. "Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending a full investigation into your actions during the November 15th incident. If the investigation concludes that your actions constituted gross negligence, willful violation of safety protocols, or behavior that endangered patients or staff, your employment with St. Mary's Hospital will be terminated." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, each one precisely calculated to cause maximum damage. Suspended, without pay, terminated, for saving Frank Morrison's life. "You can't be serious," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. as the full absurdity of the situation became clear. I took 3 bullets defending a patient. I did exactly what my oath as a nurse requires. I protected someone who couldn't protect himself. Your oath as a nurse, Dr. Kellerman said coldly, also requires you to follow hospital policy and maintain patient safety through established procedures, not through vigilante heroics that endanger everyone around you. Vigilante heroics. The phrase hit Sarah like a slap across the face. Everything she had done, every instinct she had followed, every value she had learned in nursing school was being reduced to vigilante heroics by people who had probably never treated a patient in their lives. Sarah stood up, ignoring the sharp pain in her side and the way the movement made her shoulder throb. Frank Morrison is alive today because I made a split-second decision to put his life before my own safety. If that's not nursing, then I don't know what is. What it is, Margaret said, also standing, is a liability nightmare and a clear violation of established protocol. You're suspended for 2 weeks while we conduct our investigation. During that time, you are not to enter hospital premises except for your own medical appointments. You will surrender your hospital identification badge, your access cards, and any hospital property in your possession. Robert Chen, the risk management director, slid a paper across the table toward Sarah. You'll also need to sign this agreement stating that you will not discuss the incident with media representatives or post about it on social media. The hospital's reputation must be protected during the investigation. Sarah looked at the document, reading the legal language that essentially demanded her silence about an incident where she had nearly died protecting a patient. The hospital wanted to control the narrative to ensure that their version of events, the one focused on policy violations rather than life-saving heroism, was the only one that reached the public. "And if I refuse to sign this?" Sarah asked. Patricia Wells answered immediately. Refusal to sign could be considered an additional violation of your employment agreement and grounds for immediate termination, without the benefit of an investigation. Sarah felt like she was drowning in bureaucracy, suffocating under layers of policy and procedure that seemed designed to punish anyone who cared more about patients than paperwork. She picked up the pen, her hand shaking slightly, whether from anger or medication she wasn't sure, and signed her name at the bottom of the document. "Clean out your locker and turn in your badge by the end of the day," Margaret said, her tone suggesting the meeting was over. "Someone from Human Resources will contact you about the investigation schedule." Sarah walked out of that conference room feeling like she was moving through a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. The hallways of St. Mary's, hallways she had walked thousands of times over the past 2 years, where she had rushed to save lives and comforted grieving families, suddenly felt foreign and hostile. Nurses she had worked alongside for months avoided eye contact, whether from embarrassment, fear, or simple awkwardness. The elevator ride to the staff locker room felt like a descent into hell, each floor marking another step away from the career she had built and the identity she had forged as a nurse. When the doors opened on the basement level where the staff facilities were located, Sarah hesitated for a moment, wondering if she could somehow pretend this was all a mistake, that she could return to her normal routine and forget the meeting had ever happened. But the weight of the suspension letter in her pocket reminded her that this was real. Her career at St. Mary's Hospital was over, killed not by incompetence or malpractice, but by courage. In the locker room, Sarah stared at her belongings with a mixture of nostalgia and bitterness. An extra stethoscope, the good one she had bought with her first paycheck. A coffee mug with a faded "World's Best Nurse" logo. A gift from her mother after graduation. A photo of her nursing school graduating class, all of them bright-eyed and convinced they were going to change the world through healthcare. A small, succulent plant that had somehow thrived under fluorescent lights. 2 years of her life reduced to items that fit in a small cardboard box. The stethoscope felt particularly heavy in her hands. She had saved for months to buy it, researching brands and models like other people shopped for cars. It had been with her for every shift, every patient, every emergency. Now it felt like a relic from a previous life. As she packed the last of her things, Dr. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. His face was grim, and he looked like he hadn't slept since the night of the shooting. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his scrubs wrinkled, his expression haunted. Sarah, I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I tried to speak up for you in there, but— But what? Sarah asked, not looking up from her locker. But protecting a patient's life isn't worth defending? That's not fair, and you know it, Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. What you did was brave, incredibly brave, but it was also against every protocol we have, and protocols exist for reasons. Sarah slammed her locker shut, the metal clang echoing through the small room like a gunshot. Sometimes protocols aren't enough, Marcus. Sometimes you have to choose between following rules and doing what's right. And sometimes following rules is what keeps everyone safe, Dr. Rodriguez replied, though his voice lacked conviction. What if those gunmen had decided to shoot up the entire emergency department because you escalated the situation? What if, Sarah interrupted, spinning to face him. What if Frank Morrison was your father lying on that gurney? Would you still be talking about protocols? Would you still be defending a system that punishes nurses for protecting patients? Dr. Rodriguez didn't answer. He couldn't because they both knew that when faced with that choice, watching a loved one die or risking everything to save them, he would have made the same decision Sarah had made. Sarah picked up her cardboard box and walked past him toward the exit. I'll be back for the investigation hearing. After that, I guess we'll see if saving a man's life is still considered good nursing. The next week passed like a fever dream of doubt, anger, and crushing isolation. Sarah sat in her small one-bedroom apartment staring at walls covered with certificates and awards from nursing school, trying to make sense of what had happened to her life. The local news had picked up the story. Nurse takes bullets to save veteran, but the hospital had issued a carefully worded statement emphasizing their commitment to established safety protocols and declining to comment further on ongoing personnel matters. The disconnect between the public narrative and the private reality was staggering. Strangers on social media were calling her a hero, but her own hospital had suspended her for the same actions. Friends from nursing school were reaching out with support and disbelief, unable to understand how protecting a patient could be grounds for termination. Frank Morrison had tried to visit her twice, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to see him. She couldn't face the gratitude in his eyes when her own career was crumbling around her. She couldn't bear to explain why the hospital had suspended her for saving his life, couldn't find words to make sense of a system that punished courage and rewarded compliance. The doubt crept in slowly, like cold water through a cracked foundation. Maybe the administrators were right. Maybe she had acted recklessly. Maybe her split-second decision had put others at risk in ways she couldn't see. Maybe being a good nurse meant following protocols, not playing hero. She found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about nursing, about healthcare, about the oath she had taken to do no harm. Had she harmed Frank by putting him in a situation where he felt compelled to speak up? Had she harmed other patients by potentially escalating the situation? Had she harmed herself by acting on instinct rather than training? Late at night, when the pain medication wore off and her wounds ached, Sarah would lie in bed replaying those crucial seconds over and over again. She would see the gunman's finger on the trigger, see Frank's defiant expression, see the muzzle swinging toward an elderly veteran who had already given so much to his country. And every time she reached the same conclusion, she would do it again. But that certainty felt increasingly isolated and unsupported. If she was right, why was she suspended? If her actions were appropriate, why was the hospital conducting an investigation? If she had saved a life, why did she feel like her own life was falling apart? The silence in her apartment was deafening. No monitors beeping, no pages overhead, no controlled chaos of the emergency department. Just silence and doubt and the dull ache of healing wounds that seemed to mirror the deeper pain of a broken career. Her savings account would last maybe 2 months if she was careful. After that, she would need to find another job, probably in another city, probably with a black mark on her employment record that would follow her everywhere. The investigation might clear her of wrongdoing, but it might just as easily result in termination for cause, making it nearly impossible to find work as a nurse anywhere else. Sarah stared at her nursing license mounted on the wall beside her diploma. 7 years of school, 2 years of experience, thousands of hours learning to be the kind of nurse who put patients first, and it might all be over because she chose to act instead of hide when action was needed most. On the 10th day of her suspension, as she sat at her kitchen table staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier, Sarah's phone rang. She almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, a Washington, D.C. area code that she didn't recognize, and she had stopped taking calls from reporters days ago. The media attention had been overwhelming at first, with journalists wanting to know about her background, her motivations, her feelings about being suspended for saving a life. But the novelty had worn off quickly, as news cycles do, and the calls had dwindled to occasional requests for follow-up interviews. But something made her pick up on the fourth ring, maybe just the need to hear another human voice after days of isolation. "Is this Sarah Chen?" The voice was deep, authoritative, but warm in a way that suggested genuine concern rather than professional obligation. "Yes, this is Sarah." "Ms. Chen, this is General David Morrison, United States Marine Corps. I believe you recently saved the life of my father, Frank Morrison." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had known Frank was a Marine, but she hadn't known his son was still serving, let alone at the rank of general. The surprise in her voice was evident as she replied, "General Morrison, yes, I was Frank's nurse when he was brought into the emergency department." "Miss Chen, I want to be very clear about something from the start," General Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from leading Marines in combat situations. "What you did that night, throwing yourself between armed gunmen and my father, that wasn't just brave. That was the kind of courage under fire that we spend years training Marines to develop. And you did it instinctively, without training, without backup, without hesitation." Sarah sat down heavily at her kitchen table, unsure where this conversation was headed, but grateful to hear someone speak about her actions in terms of courage rather than policy violations. "I just did what felt right in the moment, General." "You did what heroes do," General Morrison said firmly, "and I understand that your hospital has suspended you for your actions." Felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of her suspension. "They said I violated protocol by engaging with the gunmen instead of following lockdown procedures." "Miss Chen, I've spent 30 years in the Marine Corps. I've seen courage in many forms, and I've seen bureaucracy try to punish that courage when it doesn't fit neatly into established procedures." His voice carried a note of anger that suggested he had personal experience with such situations. "What happened to you is wrong. Completely wrong." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, the first tears she had allowed herself since the shooting. For 10 days, she had held back the emotion, trying to stay strong, trying to process the situation rationally. But hearing someone in authority validate her actions, confirm that she had done the right thing, broke down the walls she had built around her feelings. "Thank you for saying that, General," she managed to say through the tightness in her throat. "It means more than you know." "I'm not just calling to thank you, Ms. Chen," General Morrison continued. "I'm calling to offer you a position." Sarah blinked, sure she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "The Department of Veterans Affairs has been working to establish a new program, specialized emergency medical teams for VA hospitals across the country. Teams that can respond to crisis situations with both medical expertise and tactical awareness. Teams that can make split-second decisions under pressure and prioritize patient safety above all else." Sarah's heart began to race as she processed what she was hearing. "General, I don't understand." "You saved my father's life by acting exactly the way we want our emergency medical personnel to act," General Morrison explained. "With courage, with decisiveness, with a willingness to put patients first, regardless of personal risk or bureaucratic constraints. Ms. Chen, I want to offer you a position as the lead nurse for our new Rapid Response Medical Unit at the VA Medical Center in Washington, D.C. The words hit Sarah like a physical force. After 10 days of suspension, investigation, and doubt about her future in nursing, someone was not only validating her actions but offering her a promotion based on them. "You want to offer me a job?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just a job, a career. A chance to use your skills and your instincts to save lives without bureaucrats second-guessing your every decision. A chance to work with veterans who understand the value of courage under fire, who respect the kind of split-second decision-making that saved my father's life." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, trying to process the enormity of what she was hearing. After 10 days of doubt, after questioning everything she thought she knew about nursing, someone was telling her that her instincts had been right, that her decision to act instead of hide had been exactly what a nurse should do. The position comes with a significant pay increase over your current salary, General Morrison continued. Full federal benefits, advanced training in tactical medicine, and most importantly, the support of an administration that values quick thinking and patient advocacy over rigid protocol adherence. Sarah found herself thinking about Frank Morrison, lying on that gurney with labored breathing and determined eyes. She thought about the split second when she saw the gunman's finger tighten on the trigger. She thought about the choice, not really a choice at all, but an instinct, to throw herself between danger and someone who needed protection. General Morrison, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. When would you need an answer? How about right now, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. My father hasn't stopped talking about you for 10 days. He says you have the heart of a Marine and the skills of an angel. In my experience, that's exactly the kind of person we need taking care of our veterans. Sarah looked around her small apartment, at the nursing license on the wall, at the cardboard box of belongings from St. Mary's Hospital sitting on her kitchen counter. She thought about the investigation hearing still to come, about Margaret Whitfield's cold dismissal of her vigilante heroics, about Dr. Rodriguez's conflicted expression when he tried to defend hospital protocol over patient protection. She thought about the oath she had taken as a nurse, to protect and serve those in her care, to advocate for patients, to put their well-being above all else. She had taken 3 bullets honoring that oath, and St. Mary's Hospital had suspended her for it. But the Department of Veterans Affairs wanted to promote her for it. General Morrison, Sarah said, standing up and walking to the window, where she could see the city skyline in the distance. I accept your offer. Outstanding, the general replied, his voice carrying genuine enthusiasm. Can you be in Washington next Monday for orientation and medical clearance? I'll be there. And Ms. Chen, thank you. Not just from me, but from every veteran who will benefit from your courage and your commitment to putting patients first. You made the right choice that night, and you're making the right choice now. After she hung up, Sarah sat in her apartment for a long time, watching the afternoon sun paint patterns on her walls. For the first time in 10 days, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt peaceful, like the quiet that comes after a storm has passed and the world begins to rebuild itself. She thought about Frank Morrison, probably at home with his family, telling the story of the nurse who took bullets to save his life. She thought about General Morrison, a military leader who understood that sometimes the most important decisions happen in the space between heartbeats, when you have to choose between safety and service, between protocol and conscience. She had acted like a nurse should act, protecting patients, advocating for those who couldn't advocate for themselves, putting their lives before her own safety. And finally, someone not only recognized it, but valued it enough to build a career around it. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in the lobby of the VA Medical Center in Washington, D.C., wearing a crisp new uniform with Rapid Response Medical Unit emblazoned on the sleeve. The lobby was filled with veterans of all ages and from all conflicts, some in wheelchairs, some walking with canes, some who showed no outward signs of their service but carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of those who had served their country. The atmosphere was different from St. Mary's Hospital. There was a sense of camaraderie here, a shared understanding among both staff and patients that some things were worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth taking risks to protect. You must be Sarah Chen. The voice belonged to a woman about Sarah's age, with short brown hair and kind eyes that held the particular confidence that comes from military training. I'm Lieutenant Commander Jessica Park, Navy nurse. I'll be working with you on the Rapid Response Team. Sarah shook her hand, immediately noticing the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. It's good to meet you, Jessica. I heard about what happened at your civilian hospital, Jessica said as they walked toward the elevators. Taking 3 bullets to protect a patient? That's exactly the kind of thinking we need more of around here. It didn't feel like thinking, Sarah admitted. It felt like reacting. Sometimes the best medical decisions happen that way, Jessica replied, pressing the button for the 4th floor. when there's no time to consult protocols or committee decisions, when you just have to trust your training and your instincts and do what needs to be done. The elevator rose smoothly, carrying Sarah toward a new chapter in her nursing career. As the doors opened on the fourth floor, she saw a familiar figure waiting in the hallway, and her heart nearly stopped. Frank Morrison, looking healthier than he had in weeks, stood beside a younger man in a Marine Corps dress uniform. When Frank saw Sarah, his weathered face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the entire corridor, the kind of smile that comes from seeing someone who saved your life. "There she is," Frank said, his voice strong and clear, carrying the warmth of genuine affection. "The angel who saved my life." General Morrison stepped forward and extended his hand with the formal precision of military ceremony. "Ms. Chen, welcome to the team. Dad insisted on being here for your first day." Sarah felt her eyes well up as she shook Frank's hand, the same hand she had held while checking his pulse that night in the emergency department. "Mr. Morrison, how are you feeling?" "Like a man who got a second chance at life," Frank replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to someone who understood that sometimes you have to choose between what's safe and what's right." "That's exactly the kind of thinking we want to foster here," General Morrison added, his expression serious but proud. "Our veterans deserve medical professionals who will advocate for them, who will take risks when necessary, who will put patient care above bureaucratic convenience." As they talked, other members of the medical staff gathered around. Doctors, nurses, technicians, all of them carrying themselves with the particular confidence that comes from working in an environment where quick thinking and decisive action are valued rather than punished. Sarah noticed something immediately. These people looked at her with respect, not suspicion. They asked about her experience, her training, her philosophy of patient care. They wanted to learn from her, not discipline her. "The Rapid Response Unit will handle the most critical cases," explained Dr. Sarah Williams, the unit's medical director, a woman whose calm authority reminded Sarah of the best emergency physicians she had worked with. "Situations where standard protocols might not be sufficient. Situations where quick thinking and decisive action can mean the difference between life and death." It was exactly what Sarah had always believed nursing should be, an environment where healthcare professionals were trusted to use their judgment, their training, and their instincts to save lives without fear of bureaucratic punishment. "We have your first assignment ready," Dr. Williams continued, handing Sarah a tablet loaded with patient information. "Multi-vehicle accident coming in. 3 veterans involved, all with complex medical histories and immediate care needs. ETA 6 minutes. Sarah looked at the information, her mind already processing triage priorities, medication contraindications, and resource allocation. For the first time in 2 weeks, she felt like herself again. She felt like a nurse. Not a policy violator, not a liability risk, but a healthcare professional whose job was to save live IOs. "What are we waiting for?" Sarah asked, clipping the tablet to her uniform and checking her equipment. "Let's go save some lives." As they walked toward the trauma bay, Frank Morrison called out behind them, "Sarah, thank you for showing me that heroes still exist in this world." Sarah paused and turned back to him, this elderly Marine who had shown such courage in the face of danger, whose defense of the emergency department staff had triggered the events that changed both their lives. "Mr. Morrison, you showed me that some fights are worth having. Some choices are worth the consequences." The trauma bay doors swung open with a familiar whoosh, and Sarah stepped back into the world she belonged in. A world where split-second decisions could save lives, where courage was valued over compliance, where nurses were trusted to act like the healthcare heroes they were trained to be. The monitors beeped their familiar tune. The antiseptic smell filled her lungs like the breath of life itself. The controlled chaos of emergency medicine surrounded her like a warm embrace from an old friend. Sarah Chen didn't tremble under pressure. She never had. And now she worked for people who understood that sometimes the most important medical decisions happen in the space between heartbeats, when you choose to act instead of hesitate, when you put patients first regardless of personal cost. In the distance, she could hear the sirens approaching. 3 veterans who needed help, and Sarah was ready to provide it. Not because protocol demanded it, but because her oath as a nurse demanded it. Because sometimes the most important medical protocol was having the courage to act when action was needed most. As the ambulance doors swung open and the first patient was wheeled in, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline and purpose that had always defined her nursing career. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, working for people who understood that courage under fire wasn't a liability. It was the highest calling of the healing profession.